Hello, and thank you for joining us for another weekly video update on the current conditions and the actions that are being taken to address the current high water emergency situation. Now, since the start, we've been getting a lot of questions and comments from interesting parties about the situation that we're in. And today, I've asked our Chief Engineer, John Mitnick, to help answer some of the most common questions that we've received from the public on social media to dispel some of the misinformation and help educate everyone. So let's just dive in, John. The first question that we're getting a lot is, why is the regional water management system split between the state and the federal governments? Our residents want to know what part of the system the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates and which part is the responsibility of the South Florida Water Management District. And it can be confusing. Can you help clear this up a little bit?
Certainly. Really started back in the 1940s. The system that we know today really got its birth, so to speak, back then. It was after two hurricanes came through South Florida and there was widespread flooding in 1947. That's when the state of Florida asked the federal government for assistance. That assistance came in the form of the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project. So it's really that project that built a lot of the canals and pump stations that we have crisscrossing South Florida today. And it's the primary water control system or flood control system that the South Florida Water Management District operates today. So it started its construction in the early 1950s, and the latter stages of it wasn't completed until the 1970s or so. And in that process, after the Corps of Engineers, working as the federal government's construction arm, so to speak, after they completed a project, then they would then turn it over to what they call the non-federal sponsor, which at that point in time was the South Florida Water Management District's predecessor, the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control District. So after they completed a portion of the project, they would turn it over to the state and what is now the South Florida Water Management District to then operate and maintain those canals or pump stations that they built. So the different pieces of the system, we'll talk about Lake Okeechobee to start with. In that turnover of the completed project, the Corps of Engineers retained all of the operational control and operational responsibility for Lake Okeechobee and how it's managed, how it's operated, and also the dike, the Herbert Hoover dike, surrounding Lake Okeechobee. So they held on to the operations of all of that because of the navigation channel that runs from Stewart through Lake Okeechobee all the way over to Fort Myers. So that falls within their responsibility to solely maintain and operate. They also maintain operational control and maintenance responsibilities for some of the water control structures in between the water conservation areas, so going from Conservation Area 1 down into Conservation Area 2, and then of course down out of Conservation Area 3 down into Everglades National Park. So you've heard us talk about a lot about the S12s and their operations at the southern end of Water Conservation Area 3. So all three of those sets of structures, the S10s, 11s, and 12s, are all still operated and maintained by the Corps of Engineers. So that leaves the rest of the system throughout South Florida. The rest of that system is now the primary operational responsibility of the South Florida Water Management District. But we don't do that in isolation. We operate the system in compliance with the water control plans given to us by the Corps of Engineers. So we're responsible for opening and closing gates. We do a lot of that here from our control room here in West Palm Beach. We do it via our telemetry system and can open and close gates, turn on and off some pump stations, other pump stations, the larger pump stations that we have. We always have to have people manned inside the facility to be able to operate those facilities. But that's sort of some of the division of the responsibilities. There are certain parts of the system that the federal government retained and they still have operational control over. And there are other portions of the system that they then turned over to what they call the local sponsor or the South Florida Water Management District.
Good. Thank you for clearing that up. And the next question that we frequently get asked is, why can't we just flood the privately owned agricultural areas in the Everglades agricultural area and use those lands to store excess water from the lake on so the Corps doesn't have to make the discharges to the estuaries? And it does sound like a simple solution, but in fact, I think what they're suggesting would be illegal. Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of those lands in the EAA, the Everglades Agricultural Area, are all privately owned lands. Neither the Water Management District, the state of Florida, nor the Corps of Engineers has the legal right to flood someone's property. We can no longer flood those privately held lands any different than we can flood the homes in Wellington, Weston, Sunrise, or the city of Stewart. They all are privately held lands. They all have the same equal rights, and you can no longer flood those lands without that landowner's permission.
Right. Another question that we're being asked a lot is, why was water being pumped back into Lake Okeechobee, or some would call it back pumping, into Lake Okeechobee from the EAA as the lake was already rising after we had the record rainfall in May? And I did a little research. In fact, we've done very little back pumping, and that was only done to protect residents that were in danger of flooding during the May situation. Can you explain that a little more?
Certainly, and you're right. There is a lot of confusion on this issue, and people term it back pumping. So let's draw a distinction between back pumping and back flowing into the lake via gravity, because there are portions of the system that flow backwards towards Lake Okeechobee just via gravity, and it's not water that's pumped. Generally speaking, there are 3 pump stations on the southern end of Lake Okeechobee. Those pump stations are the S2, the S3, and the S4 pump stations. So when we talk in terms of back pumping, under the permit that we have from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, back pumping really is only a term that is related to the S2 and the S3 pump stations. Those pump stations is associated with a lot of the issues of Lake Okeechobee and how the system was plumbed. The original system drew floodwaters and stormwater runoff in 2 directions south of Lake Okeechobee. One, it moved that water south into the water conservation areas, and then there was sort of a basin divide about halfway up the Everglades agricultural area, and that's the reason why the 2 pump stations, S2 and 3, were constructed by the Corps as part of the federal project to pull that water north. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s when that practice started to change, and moving that water backwards up to the north and into Lake Okeechobee came out of favor, so to speak. And additional capacity was trying to be provided to move all that water to the south. So those 2 stations have not been used this year. They haven't been used since Hurricane Irma last year.
Right.
So I would say we have not been back pumping from the Everglades agricultural area to Lake Okeechobee at all this year. That leaves the 1 station, the S4 pump station, that serves the city of Clewiston.
Right.
That particular station and that particular basin, unlike the other 2 that have routes to the south and down into the conservation area, there's no other place for that water to go. It only has 2 choices. Either 1, it flows as pumped north back into Lake Okeechobee, or 2, it flows through a very small structure, the S235 structure, that leads over to the Caloosahatchee River. It's a very small structure, very limited capacity. So the S4 pump station is the flood control, is the flood protection for the city of Clewiston. If that station is not operated, then there are residents and homes within businesses within the city of Clewiston that will be impacted. So we have not used the S4 pump station that much this year. That's the one that you refer to has only been sparingly used. Right. It was only used in the month of May with some of those excessive rainfalls. Right. You recall in one of our prior video updates, when we talked about the excessive rainfall in the month of May, it was 300% above average. Right. So as a result of those heavy rains, the S4 pump station was operated to move some of that flood waters back into Lake Okeechobee. On the other side of the coin, backflowing of water via gravity, that happens in a couple other locations. We've talked about it before, backflowing from the C-44 canal in Martin County, having that backflowed into Lake Okeechobee.
And C-44 being the St. Lucie River.
Correct, the St. Lucie River. Then there's also the L8 canal that is in western Palm Beach County. For a period of time after those heavy rains during the month of May, it was also backflowing into Lake Okeechobee. When When you look at the L8 Canal, it's essentially a dead-end canal. It terminates to the north end at Lake Okeechobee and to the south end just above Conservation Area 1, right there at the junction of Southern Boulevard, right at the top of the refuge. Because of that canal, the desired flood protection route is off to the east and taking it to tide.
Right.
But because that canal is and those communities are so far to the west in western Palm Beach County, they have to wait for all of those eastern communities to drain first. You have to wait for Royal Palm Beach to have their drainage. You have to wait for the city of Wellington to get their drainage. And once those two are under control, then a lot of those waters from the L8 Canal can start being taken off to the east and to tide. So it was only during that period of time that the L8 Canal was backflowing into Lake Okeechobee. Since then, as we all know, unfortunately, Lake Okeechobee has risen. Right. So water has not been backflowing from the L8 Canal for the last several weeks.
John, that's a very clear explanation of what's going on. And what I also know is the amount of water that's coming in when the back pumps have to be used is very, very small in comparison to inflows, say, from north of Lake Okeechobee.
Yes, Randy, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the amount of water that actually does get back pumped when those two facilities, S2 and 3, are utilized is very small in comparison to the overall inflows to Lake Okeechobee. The overall inflows, the vast majority of that water is coming from the north, coming down from the northern watersheds, and the amount that is contributed from the southern portions of Lake Okeechobee is very small.
And I think that it's probably less than 5% of the total inflow is coming in from the back pumping.
Right.
John, what is our long-term plan for improving the timing and the quality of freshwater flows that are going into the northern estuaries? And by that, we're talking St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee.
Well, as you know, in the past, we've talked a lot about all the work that is going on to the flood control system and the restoration projects that are going on in South Florida. So we've got a number of different projects, and I'll just kind of walk through the system starting in the north. You've got the Kissimmee River Restoration Project that's slated to be completed by the Corps of Engineers in 2020. With the completion of that project, it'll increase the extent of the floodplain north of Lake Okeechobee. It'll be able to slow down and attenuate. We tend to refer to it as dynamic storage, because it's not just storage you're putting water and keeping and holding it. It's extending that floodplain, holding back some of that water on the floodplain, allowing it to evaporate, seep into the ground, increase groundwater, and attenuate its flow as it makes its way down towards Lake Okeechobee. Of course, just this week, you have the Corps of Engineers holding several different public meetings on the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Project. Right. So there's storage and treatment facilities under that project that'll help the situation as well. When we move off to the east, the Water Management District later this year will be completing the C44 stormwater treatment area, followed by the Corps of Engineers completing the C44 reservoir in 2020 as well. Those projects will also help the situation that we're currently in now. On the other side, we have the C43 reservoir that is currently under construction by the Water Management District, and you'll see in the coming months we'll be taking to our governing board for approval the final phase of the construction contract that will allow completion of that project over the next several years.
That's the walls around it.
Correct. It's a very large reservoir. It's about 170,000 acre feet of water. It sits on about 10,000 acres of land. Its deepest point will be 25 feet deep. In addition to that, the district has been working very hard to expedite the implementation of the Central Everglades Planning Project that will help us start opening up the southern end of the system and being able to create some of that capacity to be able to move water to the south and move it down through the system, get it down into Everglades National Park and moving towards Florida Bay like everybody wants it to. So it's a lot of those ongoing restoration projects that in the long term, the quicker we can get through those, the quicker we can get them implemented and in the ground, it increases our flexibility to be able to store, manage, and treat and convey that water down through the system so it doesn't have to be discharged to the east and west.
Well, that's great, John, in moving water out of the southern end of the system. And I also understand that the Corps of Engineers is going to undertake a project that will look at the way Lake Okeechobee is managed. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, as everyone knows, the Corps of Engineers is currently going through a remediation effort for the Herbert Hoover Dike and strengthening and improving the structural integrity of the Herbert Hoover Dike over the next several years. And it's something even the state of Florida over the last 2 years has contributed $100 million of our own state money towards the federal government so they can expedite the implementation and repair of the Herbert Hoover Dike. In addition to just repairing the dike and doing the physical infrastructure work and engineering concrete type work, so to speak, there's also changes to the regulation schedule that have to be employed. So the Corps of Engineers has recently committed to starting reevaluation of the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule coming up in 2019, so as to coincide and team up the completion of the infrastructure work with a new regulation schedule to go along with that repaired facility.
Here's another good question that we received about the water that you're moving out of the conservation areas south of the lake. These are the big water conservation areas, and you're moving water out of that to make room for more Lake Okeechobee water south. What is the environmental impact that we get moving all of this water from the water conservation areas and Lake Okeechobee out to tide, out to the ocean to get rid of it? What effect does that have on the coastal areas of Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade counties?
Yeah, I'm sure everybody's obviously seen all the news reports of what's going on in the different estuaries in the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie estuary, and the detrimental impacts that Lake Okeechobee is having on those environments. It's a little bit different when you start getting down into Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade counties and that water that we're talking about moving to tide. Prior to that Lake Okeechobee water, so to speak, getting to the coastal areas along Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, it comes down through the central portion of the system. It's got to move through the conservation areas. Prior to it even moving into the conservation areas, it gets treated through the district's stormwater treatment areas. Right. So we have roughly 60,000 acres of stormwater treatment area in the Everglades agricultural area. So the water will move through those stormwater treatment areas, then it gets into the water conservation areas, and it's not until after it passes through the conservation areas that it'll come out into the coastal canals and make its way towards the coast and discharged out to tide that way. So that water coming from Lake Okeechobee goes through those series of processes. By the time it comes out of the water conservation areas, it is no different than some of the local basin runoff that occurs just along in Broward County, so to speak, from the cities of Sunrise, Weston, etc. All of that water gets mixed together, and that's what's discharged out to tide down in those 3 counties itself.
Why isn't the district posting warnings about the blue-green algae in Lake Okeechobee and in the estuaries?
Well, really, there's 2 other state agencies that have the lead role in those postings. So I'm sure people are familiar with beach closures, and typically the health department will go out and issue a beach closure. In this situation, in regards to the current crisis with the algae and the algal blooms that we're experiencing, it's the Department of Health is working with the local county health departments that has the responsibility of posting those signs. In conjunction with the Department of Health, there's also the Florida Department of Environmental Protection that is responsible and charged with sampling water quality and measuring water quality. The Water Management District does assist the Florida Department of Environmental Protection when they ask us to collect those samples. But collecting those samples and testing them and providing that feedback and those test results are really the responsibility of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, John. It's very informative, and we hope this information will help clear up some of the misunderstandings about the current high water emergency situations that we're facing, also how water is managed here in South Florida. And if you have more questions, we would encourage everyone to visit the webpage that you see on your screen, and this webpage is dedicated specifically for this emergency. So thank you so much, and we'll be back next week with another update.